Everybody, welcome to Living History. I'm Andrew Samtoy, and I'll be moderating tonight's discussion. We started Living History to have an in-depth discussions of historical events, including how they shaped our community and how they affect our community today. Throughout a good portion of the early 20th century, Cleveland was an industrial and economic powerhouse. It was one of the most wealthy and prosperous cities in the country and in the world. And a big reason for that was the Cuyahoga River, which allowed industry to thrive on its banks and ship goods to Lake Erie and around the world. But part of the cost of that prosperity was pollution, a lot of pollution, much of which ended up washing into the Cuyahoga River to be taken out to the lake. It got so bad that obviously in 1969, the river famously caught fire. The river had caught fire before without attracting significant attention. And in fact, many rivers in America were just as polluted as the Cuyahoga and had caught fire as well. But the fire in Cleveland in 1969 caught the attention and the imagination of the world in a way that other fires had not. So this month, we're looking at the burning river. We'll look at the history of the Cuyahoga, what happened in 1969, the response, where the river is now, and potential problems that the river faces for the future. I am joined by three panelists, each with a particular knowledge about the river. We have Michael Rotman, who's a historian. He's written extensively about the river, and he's also a social studies teacher here in Cleveland. If we could give him a round of applause. We have Ben Stefanski, who was the utilities director for the city of Cleveland when the river caught fire. And we actually have the Time magazine that came out in August of 1969, where he's standing behind Mayor Stokes at the time. And he got quite a bit of attention for that. So if we could give him a round of applause. And last but certainly not least, Professor Julie Wolin from Cleveland State, and she studies water quality and has been close to many of the water quality issues happening in Northeast Ohio right now. So if we could welcome her. I know I didn't do justice for you in those short descriptions, so I was wondering if you could also introduce yourself and just say why the river holds importance for you, because you've all been connected to it in some way. So Julie, would you mind just a short statement about that?
So my background is in Great Lakes research, and I'm very tied to the Great Lakes. I come from that other state north of here, and so one of the things I love about Cleveland is that it has the Cuyahoga River, and I know the importance of the Cuyahoga River because it's one of the areas of concern in the Great Lakes. And so when I moved to Cleveland, it was natural for me to start looking at the Cuyahoga and looking at the history of it and also the things that are going on in it, and some really interesting things and very exciting things happening today.
Fantastic. Ben?
Well, it's really deja vu for me to be back here. I'm probably one of the youngest cabinet members to be associated with Carl Stokes. Of course, Dennis Kucinich then had his young ladies that were 21 and 22 on the cabinets. But it was there was no pre-plan to all of this. I personally, back when I got out of Michigan Law School in '64, was going to run for the state legislature. I wanted to be publicly involved, and my father knew Ray T. Miller, the county chairman here, and Ray T. Miller called me into his office and said, you know, my son is a legislator down in Columbus. He is divorced and he's an alcoholic, and we can't let you run for the state legislature and live in Columbus. So I backed off. You know, the young kid, you listen to what advice you're getting. But I really didn't campaign for Carl Stokes, but I watched everything he did. I was up until 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning that election night to get him elected. And then I went down to the big party they had at Public Auditorium, his inauguration party. And lo and behold, he comes by, had met him before, and next to him is standing my uncle. And my uncle was Anthony Rutkowski, and he was a municipal judge, but before that, he was the liquor inspector for Governor Lauschie to close down some of the Pettibone clubs and other clubs in Cleveland that were illegally here. And I was quite surprised, but then I found out later that when Carl got out of Minnesota Law School, his first job was working for my uncle in the liquor department enforcement. So that's where the connection went, and a few days later I got a call and asked if I would come down and meet with Carl Stokes and the Hotel Cleveland, and he offered the position of utilities director. I had no experience whatsoever in any of the utilities that were operating, but that was my introduction to Carl Stokes and working in government for 3 years after that.
And we'll get into your role in the river in this discussion too. So
I hope so. Well, I'm an eyewitness. See, everybody else has got material they have to read up, and I was there.
And speaking of that,
yeah. So, well, my favorite movie growing up was Major League. The story of the Indians in the 1980s. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but it starts very famously, the opening scene, with the song "Burn On" by Randy Newman. Burn on, Big River, burn on. So from a very young age, I knew Cleveland, the city I grew up in, was the city with the burning river. We always heard about that. I didn't really know much about what that meant, even though it sort of fascinated me that a river could catch on fire. And it wasn't until I started working at Cleveland State and doing research for the Cleveland Historical smartphone app that I started to delve into the story. And the more that I learned about it, the more complex that I realized the story was, and the more that I realized that the river had caught on fire before. It wasn't the first time in 1969, and the fascination kind of grew from there.
and that speaks to one of the reasons we chose this. A lot of people know about the burning river, but they don't necessarily know the full story behind it. So someone asked me why we were doing this earlier, and my explicit goal is for everybody in this room to walk out thinking that they know more about the burning river than anybody else in Northeast Ohio. I want that knowledge to be shared here. And so we're going to be having this discussion. We'll have a few statements towards the end, and then it will be Q&A and comments. So if you feel like there's something that you want to know about the river or about what's happening, feel free to come up. There's going to be a mic up here, so you'll be able to make those comments then. But first, starting out, Michael, in one of the articles that you wrote that the story of the Cuyahoga River Fire of 1969, the event that sparked pop songs, lit the imagination of an entire nation, and badly tarnished a city's reputation, is built more on myths than reality.
Right.
Could you tell us what some of those myths are?
Sure. So the Cuyahoga River, as you said in your introduction, it caught on fire many times before 1969, and a lot of the earlier fires were much, much worse. In fact, the famous picture in the Time magazine that you talked about is not actually of the 1969 fire, which was actually not really photographed at all. The photo in the Time magazine was actually from the 1952 fire, which was a much worse fire. So the fascination that kind of grew out of the fire of 1969 is kind of ironic, because 100 years prior to that, the river had been catching on fire again and again without really the general public really noticing or really caring all that much at all. In fact, the first time the river caught fire was 1868. If you look into the early history of the river, it starts to develop industrially around the time of the Civil War. One of the big initial industries is oil refineries. So they shipped oil from Pennsylvania by rail to the flats in Cleveland, where it would be refined into kerosene. Kerosene back then was used for lighting. It lit lamps. That was the major profitable use that they were using, that they were refining crude oil. One of the waste products made during the process of refining crude oil into kerosene was gas or petroleum, which basically runs our economy today. But they didn't really know what to do with it back then. So what was going on in a lot of these early oil refineries in the 1860s, they were just dumping hundreds of thousands of barrels. John D. Rockefeller says this himself in his biography. Hundreds of thousands of barrels of petroleum were just being dumped as a waste product straight into the Cuyahoga River. So even though industrialization really starts around the 1860s, by 1868, we see the first time the river catches fire in the flats in Cleveland.
And Julie, a question that I had for you is, what 100 years or 101 years of dumping this stuff into a river, what does that do? I mean, we can see the pictures of oil floating on the surface and know that the river caught fire, but what does that do to the health of the river, and what effects does that have downstream for Lake Erie?
Well, over time, what happens is some of those sediments will be buried in the bottom of the river, but some of them will actually move out into the lake itself. And so you have what are called legacy sediments that are found in Lake Erie that are basically leftovers from this industrial era and dumping of these materials. Now, some of them over time will degrade, but some of them will be what we call persistent chemicals, and so they will persist in the sediments. Over time they may get buried, but when we have dredging or major storm events, that can resuspend them, and then they slowly will have to settle out again.
Okay, and Ben, for you, at this point in the 1960s, I know you grew up in Cleveland as well.
Yes, I did.
Were people worried about this? Were they concerned about the river?
Not about the river. They were concerned with air pollution because that affected everybody. And I remember, I'm basically from the Slavic Village neighborhood, and I remember working at the bank when I was in college and law school, and during the summer we had the windows open and the soot was, all over the place. And so, Ralph Perkin, air pollution was the big thing through the late 50s and early 60s. But the river was sort of a secondary thought because it didn't affect everybody on a daily basis, and they were still turned on the tap and the water was clear. So it was a secondary thought through the 60s until we started to look at the river when I was with Carl.
Okay, and then Michael and Ben, can you set the stage then for 1969, the day before, say, the river caught fire? I know you mentioned that there were some severe storms the day before.
Well, that was a couple weeks before.
Couple weeks before.
Yeah.
But could you just describe, was there anything different about that time period, the time before?
Well, politically and nationally there was, because Carl Stokes was a personality that was known all over the country and all over the world because he was the first black man elected to a major American city. And so the national press here was here on a daily basis. They were always looking. Every little thing that he did, it was expanded. And so that was why there was all this attention given to every event and to this particular burning of the river.
And I'll say, too, it's interesting to think about what was going on in the days and months before the river caught fire in 1969. I think part of the myth is that at this time in 1969, the flats were some cesspool of waste and pollution. But already by this time, you see things starting to shift. A lot of the industry had closed down by then, and the flats were becoming the sort of entertainment destination that kind of popped up even more so in the 80s and 90s. In fact, I have a Plain Dealer editorial by George Condon from March 1969, where March 69, which is a couple months before the river catches fire, he says, "What the flats has is a precious quality called atmosphere. It's a quality that's invaluable anywhere. The most telling reaction of people who wander into the flats, usually with considerable trepidation, is that it's not like being in Cleveland." So people hadn't, right? So people hadn't been down there. They weren't familiar with it. Maybe they were expecting, like I said, some horribly polluted place, which it was in some aspects, but it was also starting to get a little bit better right before all this national attention gets shed on it.
And you mentioned that industry was shutting down at the time, or there were industries that were shutting down that weren't polluting as much. Was that some sort of concerted effort, or was there...
Yeah, and Ben, you could probably speak to this more than I could, but already after the 52 fire, which sparked that really fascinating photograph that appeared in Time of the tugboat just engulfed in flames and flames spreading across the water, that caused a considerable amount of damage, I think hundreds of thousands, maybe even close to $1 million. And I think that's where really a lot of the efforts to clean up the river started by the industry down there.
Okay.
But it was the state of Ohio that was permitting all of this pollution because they were the ones that licensed the industries along the Cuyahoga to dump into the river. The city had no responsibility. They had nothing to say about that. And that's one of the things that Carl Stokes was always operating from a positive position. Because a few months earlier, we had passed a $100 million bond issue. A bond issue was to expand the treatment plants. The voters voted 63% to be taxed $20 a year in order to improve the treatment of waste. But at the same time, the river was continuing to be polluted because the state was responsible for the licensing. There was some reduction of pollution in the river because some plants were closing because of becoming obsolete. And one of the best examples is the Harshaw Chemical on Harvard Road. Harshaw Chemical, if you look around there, it's all fenced in. They have police there 24 hours a day today because it's contaminated with uranium and whatever else they did there. They still haven't cleaned that up. But that's there's been the transition from different manufacturing processes that closed down some facilities.
Okay, fantastic. And Ben, I'm going to go back to you because you're one of, I think, maybe two people in this room who was there or who was on the Cuyahoga that day.
Yeah, right there.
There's one other in the rack. But could you describe what happened the morning that you found out that the Cuyahoga River had caught fire? And this is your personal experience. Your story.
This was my experience with Carl. He always called me at 6 or 6:30 in the morning when there was some catastrophe and asked me, I'll pick you up and we'll go look at it. And a few weeks before that, there was a big storm that came in on 4th of July, and all the trees on the west side, there was a tornado, and all the trees were down, and he called me, and we went over at 6:30 in the morning. And I like to tell this story because it's kind of interesting. And we looked around, and everything was devastated. And he says, well, I have to call the service department. Well, the service department had very few trucks, they didn't have radios, and they didn't have a big crew. Now the water department, which has nothing to do with this, but this is my sort of activism. I said, well, Carl, we got 100 trucks, we got 2,000 people, and I will get the saws, the band saws or hand saws, and my men will come out in the next 3 days and clean up the west side for you. And so I went over to Sears and Roebuck over 105th and Detroit, and I acquisitioned 24 hand saws. And I just had my men come in and take it out, and I just charge it to the city. I had a lot of nerve then. So anyway, and we cleaned up the city. So those are the kinds of things that went on. But that morning when we went down to look at the river, there was just normal river. There wasn't that. The railroad tracks were a little askewed. And but at that time, we had already passed the bond issue, and the mayor was publicly advocating the cleaning up of the river. And so he was very forceful because he had a positive background on the activities that were then. And from that, of course, he went to Congress, and he testified before Senator Muskie and Senator Udall about the Clean Water Act, and he was partially responsible for the passing of the act because he could talk about the actual problems that they had on the street, and he was a celebrity because he was the first black mayor of a major American city. And there were reporters here 24 hours a day looking at everything that he did. And so and he, of course, was a politician. So he understood how to use the press and how to get his message across to bring about change.
And so that day, he called you up, and he said, hey, we have a problem, you need to come?
Right. And so we went down to the river there, and of course he notified the press where he was going. And, all the press was there, and they ate up the story, and it became national news because this was a problem, pollution problem all over the country, but this was something concrete and something that happened just then, and it happened with Carl Stokes there, so it became national publicity.
And his reaction and your reaction, what were they when you saw the devastation from that fire?
Well, the river had burned many, many times before, and many of the fires were far, far more devastating than this fire, but it was at the right place at the right time with the right people that it got national publicity, and we had already passed a bond issue, so we were ready to pay for improvements, but it was up to the state because the state licensed every industry on the Cuyahoga River to put their polluted materials into the river. The city did not have a responsibility there.
And as utility director, then you were ready to start doing some work, but you were waiting for the state? I mean, is that how the process went?
Well, it's a little more complicated than all of that. Our effort would have then been to to make the industries put their waste into the sewer system to go into the treatment plants to be treated and then put into the lake. And that's a very expensive process. And we started with the Stokes administration a industrial waste department as part of our pollution program, with somebody going and looking at the industries and what they were draining into the river, and through publicity, they were made to alleviate some of that. So you had Republic Steel; they put in pollution abatement equipment in the steel making process.
And Julie, when you hear that from today's perspective as a scientist working with water, what's your reaction to think that was the instinct of the city at that time, or was that the best science that they had available? Or
I would say that's probably true, that it was the best science. I mean, not realizing that it would be a much more arduous process to go through to remove the chemical pollutants and the industrial pollutants rather than just sewage. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's not how it works today, obviously, but it would put a lot of pressure onto just a wastewater treatment plant to actually try to remove all that material. And there are a lot of corrosive materials in industrial waste, so it could actually destroy the system that you're trying to create unless you have. It would be very expensive, much more than I'm sure the money you had to put it together, and then cause a lot of problems down the road.
Actually, the solution today, with the construction, and some of it is completed, is big tunnels underground, 100 feet underground, where when there are storms, all the wastewater goes into these tunnels, and they're stored and then put through the treatment plant. And of course, there has to be all kinds of improvements with the treatment plant, but that is the process that the city has adopted back when we started. Because I realized when I took the job that I didn't know anything about the technical part of pollution abatement. I understood the political part and what we needed to do. It was instinctive because I was a resident of the city, and I knew we couldn't swim in the lake and the river was polluted. But we realized that we needed some expertise. So one of the things I did the year before 69 and 68 in the summer, I had a number of people from the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, come to Cleveland to sort of advise you and tell you what you might want to do. And Lee Weinberger was one of the officials from Washington. And he says, there's this young guy, he's in our department, and he's from Benedictine here, and he's got his PhD from Rensselaer, and he would be a good asset for you. And this was Ed Martin. And so Ed came to work, and that's another interesting story. And we were still early in the administration, so it wasn't that difficult to get legislation, but he required a salary of $75,000 a year, and the mayor was only getting $50,000. But we did get the legislation through, and they authorized the council to pay him $75,000, and he came here and he established our technical program to improve the treatment of all of the waste here. And that program is being developed 40 years later, but is the program that we're spending $3 billion on right now.
And before we get into the 40 years since then, I did want to, and Mike and Ben, for both of you to address this. What happened in the public, both here and nationally? I mean, we went from the public basically ignoring the river and paying more attention to air pollution to suddenly a Time article, and then what? I mean, was there an outcry? What was the reaction?
Well, prior to the fire in 1969, there were a number of environmental events, I guess you would call them, that kind of brought kind of the nature of this environmental crisis on the national scene. There was a big oil spill in Santa Barbara, the effects of which I think are still seen today, that completely polluted that beautiful ocean front. There was the book Silent Spring, which exposed DDT and the danger that DDT was causing, treated on lawns, was causing to the public. So I think environmental issues were very much in the public eye in the 60s, to the point where they hadn't been before. I think the perception of pollution was starting to change too. And that's what's interesting to me about the fire and how things changed in '69, was that perceptions of pollution were changing. There's a story about somebody passing by the Cuyahoga down on the docks and seeing it was red from the iron deposits that were pouring in there. They could see the rainbow oil slicks from the oil, and they said it was the prettiest sight they had ever seen. Right? And to put it another way, if you're working down there, and again, tens of thousands of immigrants were flocking to Cleveland on the late 1800s to work on these docks, to work in these factories, pollution was the color of money. This was a sign of prosperity. If you had a dirty river in an urban center, this was just the cost of doing business. And that starts to change, I guess, in the years after World War II, as some of the industries start to close down, and the nature of these big cities go from being industrial centers to more of service and business-oriented sites. So I think people are starting to look at pollution differently. And certainly with the 1969 fire, and whether it was a mistake or not, putting this really captivating photo from the 1952 fire in time for a national audience to see, I think it captured the public's attention, it captured their imagination, and it kind of built on this trend towards environmental concern that had already been building.
So what's the practical result of that? I mean, first off, is that something that just built over time until it became, there was a sea change in how people viewed it? Or was it something where the politicians and legislators started to immediately address this? And I'm sure Ben can also address this question as well, from what happened back in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, I mean, as late as the 1950s, there are pictures of Standard Oil of Ohio sponsored a tour of the industrial flats. And there are these wonderful, and I use the term wonderful loosely here, but there are these photos of families and young kids standing, looking over the flats, the smoke billowing out of these smokestacks, and they're all breathing it in, enjoying the sights, and seeing this, again, as a sign of prosperity. That there was really nothing wrong with it. So I think it really starts to change in the 1960s as kind of these environmental disasters start piling up and the cities start becoming less industrialized.
So were there protests against these businesses? There were
more protests against the air pollution than the water pollution. Through the late 50s and 60s. And the chief supporters of this movement were Betty Clarick, who was a environmental writer for the Cleveland Press, and Louis Seltzer used to let her go and chase the bad guys. And then there was Benny Blauschild. He was the automobile dealer from Shaker Heights that had been on this abatement kick and environmentally corrective effort for the 10 or 15 years before this. Now, they were the two people that really kept the issue before the public. And then in 1967, when Carl was elected, part of my thinking process was, here I was picked out of nowhere to be given this job, and I appreciated what Carl Stokes was all about, and realized that we had 2 years before the next election, so we only had a very short time in politics and in city government to do things that would reflect positively on his administration, because he was under a great deal of stress. He was a black man. They expected something of him great, and if he wasn't, he wouldn't get reelected in 2 years. So that was my perspective, and many of the things that I did, relighting Euclid Avenue, putting lights on the building, were all with this idea of showing progress so that he could get another 2 years and do some of the more basic things that were needed in the city, new housing in the poor inner city areas, and jobs and those kinds of things, and that takes time to do. So that was my perspective over what my responsibilities were as utilities director. So they were a little beyond just running the utilities. And one of the interesting things is all of the people that were running immediately under me are called commissioners. they all were there from 1930, because when the Depression hit and they were graduating from engineering school, the only place to get a job was at the city. And so they've been there for the last 30 or 40 years, from the 1930s till the 1965, and they were bureaucrats. So all they wanted to do is to make sure everything worked today and the next day, and there wasn't much of a ripple at all. And of course, they couldn't handle me because I came up with all these ideas of what should be done. And so we, in effect, built our own management system in the city, because these guys just wouldn't do anything. They just didn't get it.
And with those ideas, what were some of the ideas that you came up with that failed, that didn't get implemented? Do you remember any of those?
No, I don't. Well, Carl was a great guy to work for, because if you got the program together and you put it on his desk, he would get what you're after and what the meaning in the community was, and he said, go ahead and do it. Like with the bond issue, the $100 million bond issue, he says, you're crazy. 3 months before the election in May, he says, nobody will vote for that. And he had just been defeated in his wanting to increase the income tax. And lo and behold, the week before the bond issue was on the ballot, we had the Kiwanis in Cleveland marching down Euclid Avenue with a casket, and the guys were dressed in tuxedos, and the casket was the dying lake. And so the timing was just perfect through this whole, the right people were at the right places. The issues were both nationally and locally here, and we grew upon them.
And I think it's important to add, too, that Cleveland's neighborhoods literally burned, right? In 1966 with the Huff riots, and 1968 with the Glenville shootout. When the river burns in 1969, maybe that's sort of an easier problem for people to wrap their heads around, especially for people in the suburbs who have a hard time trying to make sense of the urban crisis that led to Huff and Glenville, and problems like poor housing, underemployment, poor relationship between the police and the public. So when the fire burns in 1969, you can go down to the Western Reserve Historical Society and you can see all the letters and drawings that school children from the suburbs sent to Carl Stokes' office saying, you got to fix this pollution problem. I think it's fair to say those same children aren't going to be writing about Huff or Glenville. So pollution, I think, is a natural problem for activists from around Northeast Ohio to kind of latch onto and try to take ownership of and try to fix.
Well, the other thing that Carl really caught on, and he said, was we had, I'm trying to get my thoughts together, we had determined that the suburbs were expanding, that we had all these contractors that were building all these homes all over and on the suburbs, and many of them, most of them, were basically treatment plants at the end of the street. So they weren't connected to the sewer system, they were connected to a little plant, and in a matter of a year or two, nobody was operating the plant, and it overflowed, and there was all this pollution going on. So I said to the mayor, I said, well, we'll stop giving permits to builders that are not connected to the Cleveland sewer system, which was a regional system. Unless you connect to the Cleveland system, you can't build the houses. Well, the Mayors and Managers Association within 60 days sued the city of Cleveland because they wanted these permits to continue the building. And fortunately, in 1972-73, the case was presented to Judge McMonigle. Now, most of you don't know the judge, but he was one of the most outstanding lawyers in Cleveland. And he was like 55 and said, well, I've done my thing as a lawyer. I'd like to be a judge. So he was appointed by the governor as a judge. And this is the case that he got. And he really saw through it all. And he created the regional sewer district. I mean, from the bench. There was no legislation. He said that there were 5 people from the city of Cleveland on the board that would run it, and 4 people from the suburbs. And he also gave them the authority to tax a sewer rate to everybody. And that's been contested twice in the last 40 years. It's always fallen down. So this was the major thing that changed the whole complexion in Cuyahoga County, is the creation of the regional sewer district and their ability to tax for the improvements that had to be made.
And so we want to now switch. We don't have a whole lot of time left, but I want to go, and Julie, I'm hoping you're going to be able to opine on this. The 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, I imagine that the cleanup doesn't happen overnight. Could you describe, sort of after 101 years of river fires and more than that of pollution, what does the cleanup look like starting after the fire?
So one of the things is the institution of the Clean Water Act, which is a federal act. So that then begins the process of having to have permits for pipes that dump things into rivers and lake systems. The other thing that begins to happen is the river begins to recover from these assaults that have occurred over long periods of time. Some of it is because it is an active navigational channel, the dredging process pulls the materials out of the river, the sediments. However, because they're polluted sediments, they have to be, by law, put into what's called a confined landfill. And so that's where we get the material underneath the stadium, the material under Dike 14,
the airport,
and they're actually confined so that as those materials settle, the leachate or the water that comes out of them doesn't go into Lake Erie itself, because that's a pollutant that would go into the lake otherwise.
And what would happen if it did?
It would pollute the lake, and so you'd have the toxic chemicals in the lake, which then affect all levels of aquatic life within the lake system itself. And those could cause things like, well, the things that people would see. I work with algae and zooplankton, which are microscopic, but then the downstream effect is to affect the fish.
In fact, that's what's happening today. There's a controversy you're reading in the newspaper where the EPA wants to dump part of the river dumpings in the river in the lake, and all of us say no, you're not going to do that. You got to put them in the dike or find another way of preserving that.
Yeah, and I think that's well. There's some complicated issues there because the navigational channel has to be dredged so that ships can come up, and the City of Cleveland still has active navigation where we have ships come in and deposit materials up the river. And so that is part of the economy here, and it's not something you can say, well, we'll just close off the river and won't have ships come up it anymore. But the sediments are much cleaner today in the Cuyahoga than what they were in the past. So they've definitely improved. There probably still are some issues with legacy contaminants, although by and large, a lot of those have been taken out and are in the confined landfills. The problem today that we have with a lot of the sediments is upper watershed issues. So development that goes on in the suburban areas and sediments that come down from erosion because of development in the upper watersheds.
You're talking about Akron and that.
Well, that and Furnace Run and Brecksville and all of the new suburbs, the ex-urban suburbs that have been built. What happens is it increases the amount of flow into the river systems and the side channels. Those erode the river banks, and that sediment that's eroded from those banks comes down into the Cuyahoga. And it makes its way to the navigational channel, which is it's almost like a large bathtub. So as soon as the river gets to that point, the sediments that are transported through the water slow down and the sediments fall out. And so a lot of that sediment is...
Fallout meaning what?
They settle out.
Okay.
So they settle out into the river. And so that's part of the sediment load that's coming into the navigational channel that then has to be removed. It also brings with it the nutrients and fertilizers that people are putting on their lawns and putting on their landscapes. And so that's probably a bigger issue in terms of open lake disposal. That commonly those sediments will have phosphorus associated with them. Phosphorus is one of the things that helps to feed algae in the lake and leads to harmful algal blooms. Other algal blooms too, but our big concern right now are harmful algal blooms like they had in Toledo last summer.
So we're not exactly completely clear from all of the pollution that existed before. That's the first thing to address.
Correct. So it's shifted. It's a different type today than what we were concerned about before. By and large, the industrial pollutants, unless you have an occasional spill or an intentional dumping, which is enforceable. You can be taken to court for that. Those still occur, but those are kind of episodic events. The long-term assaults are the upper basin erosion, loss of things like small streams that feed into the river system, and wetland systems that are up there that help to filtrate that material as it comes down the river.
So,
But basically, we want to be able to fish in the Cuyahoga River.
what do you mean?
To go fishing, that we have live, edible fish to fish out of the river. And that's the really goal, that you can put your boat out here and put the line in and you'll catch something. That's a very extreme goal, but that's what all this leads to.
And are you saying that's the goal now? Are we unable to do that?
There are places in the upper river that you can catch fish and they're fine. The navigational channel has some issues still in terms of the fish. Well, actually, a lot of the fish that are coming through the river are migrating in from Lake Erie, moving upstream. They spawn upstream, and then one of the big problems, and one of the things I've been working with lately, are the larval fish. So the small fish, they're usually about an inch or two long. They
Minnows?
actually start, they're
Minnows?
not even minnows, they're less than minnows.
Oh.
So they start making their way out into the lake, but they kind of lose their way in the navigational channel, which is the last 7 miles of the river before it goes into Lake Erie.
So we're still, I mean, with that, so what you're saying is that's still not fishable. That's something that we wish we could fish, and you said it's an extreme goal.
Yes.
But it's not, like when we look out, earlier there were 5 boats, 5 rowboats, I think, from one of the high schools rowing on and there were ducks and there were seagulls trying to get into the water. It looked like everything was fantastic, but that's not the case.
No, it is still a polluted river, and there are all kinds of programs to make it more inhabitable. Part of the problem in the lower channel is that you have bulkheads on both sides. There's no space for fish to migrate and to cohabitate. So they're putting in fancy screens on the sides of the bulkheads to give the fish places to spawn. And
That's actually one of the projects that I've been advising with. So there's 2 organizations, the Cuyahoga River Restoration, the AOC, and the Cuyahoga County Planning Commission are both working on what they call habitats for hard places. And so one of the big issues with these small baby fish, if you will, pre-minnow stage, is that they don't have rest stops. They don't have refuge along the steel bulkhead. And so we've been trying to rethink the steel bulkhead because it has to be there again because of ships and the blast that comes out of their thrusters would erode away the banks. It also helps keep the banks in place so they don't fall into the river and then have to be dredged out. But because of those steel bulkheads, it's not a natural river bank. It doesn't have the structure that a riverbank would have for these small baby fish as they make their way down. And so we're trying to figure out a way to put either artificial or natural types of materials into those bulkheads to soften them so that the larval fish can make their way. And so there have been multiple designs that are being developed now that we're going to be testing in the river in the near future. And there have been some other designs that we have tried that haven't worked so well. And again, it goes back to the sediment load from the upper parts of the river. We tried these floating mats that we put plants in, but what happens is the sediments come down and coat them and then basically weigh them down so much that they sink. And again, it's the upper materials. That's not material coming from the navigational channel. That's the material that's coming from upstream.
But just take a perspective that 45 years ago, they would have thought we're crazy if trying to have fish in the river.
Yep.
It was so polluted that the oil was all over the river. You used to run a skimming boat, privately run skimming boats to pick up the oil and the lumber and the pieces of trash and everything. And, just think about the coming weekends over the summer. You're going to have 5,000 people down here rowing in the river. And why has the Metro Parks put this restaurant here? Because there is an attraction to the water and a space where people can use it.
So what do we need to do as a community and for these people here as individuals to help it get to the point where we can fish? Because what you just said, there was a 1967 video I saw today, and it said that the Cuyahoga can never again be expected to be a scenic and entirely healthful scene at its terminus. Meaning, I think, what we're looking at right now, that we would never be able to see this as anything other than a oil slick river. We've come a long way, but what else do we need to do? And I think, Julie, you're particularly well suited to, because of your position, to talk about these sorts of things, especially from a microorganism perspective.
Yeah. So I think one of the things we still have an issue with are nutrients that go into the system. We need stormwater control on the landscape, particularly in the cities and in the urban and suburban areas, because one of the problems is that, as you mentioned, when we have these big rainfalls, with the combined sewer overflow system that we have underneath the city of Cleveland, we have the water that goes into the system, it mixes with sewage, and the outfalls are raw sewage during those big rain events that go either into the river or out to the lake shore. And along with that comes fecal coliform bacteria. That's why you get the high bacteria counts that say don't swim on Edgewater Beach, because of these outfalls that come out during very large rain events.
But we hope within the next couple of years, because of the construction of the sewer district, these big tunnels underneath Mill Creek and 7 Mile, is it, and the west side, that these kinds of things we're talking about will be collected in gigantic tunnels underground and then put through the treatment plant after the storm is finished. Mm-hmm. And that will be the major thrust of the regional sewer district to improve the quality in the river and lake.
It's going to be more than a couple years. It's a 30-year program and
we've always
billions
had
of
40
dollars.
Already,
but there are other things you can do on the landscape to also soften and improve the amount of material going down the storm drains. And so that's also a big issue that in terms of, you may have heard green infrastructure. So using green infrastructure to capture some of that material so that it also lessens what happens, so that you can work on those systems. And the good thing about green infrastructure is that it can also help to take those nutrients out of the system before they even go to the sewage treatment plant.
So how do we then, as individuals in this room, help move this forward?
You pay every month on the sewer tax.
But also the sewer tax that is in the state legislature, where the sewer district wants to actually have people pay for the amount of hard surface they have on their property, because that hard surface is what's taking stormwater and sending it down the drains. It's not going through the sewage treatment system. It's going down the storm drains. And so the amount of what's called impervious surface or hard surface that you have, you should have to pay more, because more of your water contributes to the problem.
And the best example of this is Fleet Avenue here in Slavic Village. It's an $8 million resurfacing of the street versus the cost ordinarily just to resurface would be $3 or $4 million. They are taking up the whole street, and they're preventing the water from going into the sewers. They have retention basins and other ecology methods of preventing the kinds of things we're talking about from getting into the sewer, into the river in the first place. And there's just more of this that have to be done over the next coming years to alleviate the problem.
So before we get to the comments section, optimistic or pessimistic about where we're going in the future? Because it sounds like there are still a lot of problems that we have to solve. There's lawsuits with the Army Corps of Engineers, whether that's going to be resolved or not. There's still these heavy sediments and pollution. Are these things that we're going to have to deal with for another 30 or 100 years? Or are we actually going to tame these problems and be able to fish on the Cuyahoga again?
I'm optimistic. So one of the things I actually looked up before I came in today was I have been working, as I mentioned, with some people doing work on the Cuyahoga. I went back to look at fish species, so the number of different types of fish that were actually in the Cuyahoga early on when the state EPA started to sample, because it's one of the ways they can show whether the river's improving or not. And so in the navigational channel in 1988, there were 0 fish species. By 1988? 1988. So no fish species that they were finding in the navigational channel when they would sample for them. By 1996, there were an average of 2 for every pass that they did. And recently, I don't know the exact date, but I know in the mid-2000s, the sewer district now actually does sampling. And at the Harvard Road Station, they came up with 28 species in the mid-2000s. And most recently, the state DNR out of Fairport Harbor has had a project where they've been working on the river for the last 3 years. And I want to say they've had over 40 species of fish that they've identified. And some of the fish, one of the things that scientists look at is, do we have the tolerant species or do we have the sensitive species? And they actually are starting to find some of the sensitive species that you would not find in the river if it was too polluted. So that's really good news. And it's really exciting news, I think.
And Ben, you seem to have
It's remarkable what has happened in the last 45 years. A few good decisions back in 1968 and 69 has resulted in the kinds of things we see happening here. And it's just time, it takes time for a lot of this to recuperate. And we're going to see, as we see now with all these people burrowing on the river, it's going to be a recreational river besides being industrial and serving the industry that's here in Cleveland.
Mike.
Yeah, I'll just say the Wolstein Group purchasing some of the rowdier East Bank bars in the early 2000s and tearing those down has certainly improved the water quality by cutting down on the public urination and vomiting going into the river. But no, in all seriousness, I think the river, I walked around just Merwin's Wharf today before I came here, and seeing the skate park, seeing some of the towpath that I know is opening up, seeing the boathouse over there. I think a lot of reasons why the Flats, maybe not necessarily as a body of water, but as an entertainment district, failed in the 80s and 90s was because it was just a place to come get as drunk as you could for the least amount of money as possible. And now that these recreational opportunities are opening up, I think in large part because of the improving water quality, I think that's a good sign, and I think that's it gives the Flats a real good chance to be sustainable in the long term.
And you can see the Metropolitan Park District, what they think of the river, because look, they put up this facility and it's very successful and they're making money and it's subsidizing what the Park District does besides the tax that you pay to the Park District.
And the other thing that comes from that is the more people you bring to the river, the more the people care about the river. And so that feeds on itself and it's a positive feedback in terms of wanting to help improve the river.
Fantastic. Well, if we could give them a quick round of applause before we go to Q&A.
What did we do?
We scheduled about 30 minutes for comments, but before we get into that, I did want to invite one of the newer, younger voices from the city to come up and say a few words. Janita McGowan, is she still here? Where? Fantastic. The Chief of Sustainability for the City of Cleveland, and we wanted to hear from her perspective, from the city perspective now, some comments about the river. So Janita, I'm hoping this one still works.
Testing. Can I just talk really loud?
Yes.
I'm good? All right. Thank you. What a great panel presentation and a good historical perspective. You didn't ask me, but I'm an optimist too. You know, our Lake Erie was once declared dead, and now we're the walleye capital of the United States. And so that's one of the greatest stories of ecological restoration on the planet. If we can do that, we can do this. Thank you. So as Chief of Sustainability, one of my major initiatives is called the Sustainable Cleveland 2019 Initiative. It's a 10-year initiative started by Mayor Jackson to kind of get everybody to work together on developing and designing Cleveland as a more thriving, resilient, and sustainable place. Why do you think we chose the year 2019? Because it's the 50th year anniversary of the last time the Cuyahoga River caught fire. And about once a decade, we get a lot of media attention with people checking in terms of how Cleveland's doing environmentally. Are we still that mistake on the lake? And the idea is by 2019, we're going to have our own gosh darn story to tell. And it's going to be different from what people expect. And I think some of the progress that we've been discussing today in the 40-some years since 1969 is testament to that. You know, some of the things that we pay attention to, we have a indicators dashboard of things we pay attention to, about 28 different indicators around how we're doing as far as sustainability. We track beach advisory days, so days that beaches are closed to recreation. Those are overall in a downward trajectory here in Cleveland. We also track the Modified Index of Well-Being, which is a host of different things like how our bugs and fish and other things that Julie could tell you a lot more about than I can are doing, and that's on a positive trajectory as well. But some of the things that aren't on a positive trajectory as it relates to our freshwater resources are plastic pollution, both macroplastics and microplastics, which are teeny tiny little pieces of plastic. I see someone here from the Port Authority. They have these boats, Flotsam and Jetsam, that go around the river and clean up debris. Plastic pollution is an emerging problem in our watershed, and the nutrient runoff. So really quick, it's the Year of Clean Water, 2015, in the city of Cleveland. Every year we have an annual theme year for sustainability. And what we're doing during the Year of Clean Water is letting people know what they can do at home and work in their community to participate in the restoration that we're talking about today to help keep our waterways fishable, swimmable, and drinkable. So I want to leave you with just a couple tips, and then I'm going to give the mic away for the rest of you. At home, we're encouraging people to install a rain barrel. The Cuyahoga County Soil and Water Conservation District is here, the rain barrel lady over there. Everybody loves the rain barrel lady. Everyone does. But we also have the Mayor's Summer Youth Employment Program, where we give away free rain barrels to City of Cleveland residents while employing high school students. It's our most popular program. We give away about 400 to 500 a year. We are encouraging people at home to switch to tap water. Did you know that if you switch from bottled water to good Cleveland clean tap water, you can save yourself $1,700 and $500 a year?
It's true.
All right. And then pick up litter in your front yard. Do a beach cleanup where you live. Lake Erie is downhill from everything, and anything you leave in your front yard or on your street makes its way into our waterways. So you can do that at home, at work. Take our Year of Clean Water, Ditch the Bottled Water pledge. Do your part to reduce plastic pollutions. Commit to reducing your bottled water use at events and meetings in your workplace. In your community, participate and adopt a beach cleanup. Or participate in our Clean Water Tour and Sweepstakes. We have monthly events between now and October. Every time you go, you can enter to win a grand prize 2-day getaway at Cuyahoga Valley National Park for you and 30 of your closest friends, all for coming out and learning more about the Year of Clean Water. So find out more at sustainablecleveland.org. Thanks.
Thanks for that. We also, before the comments, and I just saw him slip in, we owe a round of applause to our host, the Cleveland Metro Parks CEO, Brian Zimmerman.
Right there.
And he's going to...
You beat me to it.
He's going to come up and say a couple words about, I'm assuming about Merwin's Wharf and the efforts that they're making to really revitalize this area. So, Brian, can you join us?
Thank you. I get to talk about anything then if they're...
Yes, right.
Really, I'm really excited to be here, and I did catch a little bit of it. I'm a true optimist here. We wouldn't be in this particular place if we weren't. I think back over 100 years ago when Bill Stinchcomb and the Olmsteads worked on this park system. They really built it off the riparian corridors, the waterways, the Chagrin River, the Rocky River, all of the braided streams. But the Cuyahoga River was actually not part of the original plan. And that was long part of the shipping and the industry. And now it's really kind of this unique renaissance. We turn 100 in 2017. We've taken the pledge, Janita, so we're right there with you, working on reducing the water bottles. But one of the core themes that we learned through our strategic plan is really the connections to community and place. And that really ties into the towpath, 100 plus miles worth of connected trail that goes through the Cuyahoga Valley and a number of other counties to the south, whether it be Summit, Stark, Tuscarawas, and working its way down, or whether it be, I see Stephen Love's in the back, the Cleveland Foundation Centennial Lake Link Trail, which when completed will be 1.3 miles from the Scranton Road. We just hung 2 new bridges, 150-foot span bridges that are 30 feet above ground that actually replace old railroad tracks. If you think back, and I know you got the history, there was over, I think, a dozen different railroads that were operating right across from where we're sitting here today. And so we're reminded that connection to water and place is something that we've been working very hard at, whether it be the acquisition of Wendy Park, the 60-plus acres there, whether it be the water taxi concept, really re-embracing being able to move people up and down the river, whether it be all the multimodal transportation. Most people don't know this, but President Obama actually designated Cleveland, Ohio, the Cuyahoga River, in the top 50 urban waterway and worked on the connections to Lake Erie. And that's not often touted near enough, but that was one of his 50 projects selected in the country. And so it didn't come with funding yet, but it did give us a very nice designation. And so we use that in a lot of our applications as we're working forward towards. And really, I want to leave you with exactly what Janita said. I mean, we are working at the West Creek Stewardship Center. If you've seen any of the things that we've been doing related to water conservation, one of the things I'm really most proud of here at Metro Parks, we've been working in the communities, unhooking downspouts and working on rain gardens and all sorts of different things. And we know it's working because we've been testing the river. We've got the gauges on the West Creek, and we've had them there for almost 10 plus years. And now we're working on disconnecting neighborhoods, and we can actually start to see it actually decrease. And that's the ultimate goal, because all that flowage actually was all coming through West Creek into the Cuyahoga River and then ultimately down here. What's really sad, on certain days when the flooding events occur, you'll see basketball hoops, you'll see all sorts of crazy things that go floating by the river. It's unbelievable. So, again, pick your yard. I really like Janita's her useful tips, because it all ends up in our drinking water source. And what we're trying to do in the city and the partnerships, Merwin's Wharf here, this was a huge collaboration of folks, whether it be the Cleveland Rowing Foundation, the Dragon Boat Community, Ohio City Bike Cooperative, the City of Cleveland, Cleveland Metro Parks. There's really a unique opportunity to really retell the story here in Cleveland. So thank you very much for coming out to Merwin's. We hope you stick around and stay with us for a little bit longer. I really appreciate the opportunity to tell our story, and we look forward to our 100-year celebration in 2017. Thank you.
And what I'd like to do is, one thing you did not mention is that every few years you have a bond issue or a money issue on the ballot, and it has never failed. Everybody has always voted for the Metro Parks, and you see the results here today. So remember them always to vote yes for the Metro Parks issues.
Great. And we're going to wait to introduce Amy for the drawing. If you came in, hopefully you got a little raffle ticket. We have some books to give away and a rain barrel. But now this is sort of like the public comments Q&A section of it. So if anybody has any questions or comments that they want to make of the panel or of anybody that spoke about Metro Parks of the city, Brooke, do you want to come up? There's a microphone right up here. So.
Well, I'm definitely an optimist about the river, and I rode on the Cuyahoga for 6 years, and I was cleaning up trash at Edgewater Beach last week, and I care very much about the waterways. But I'm very disturbed that things like this still happen. The Precious Minerals Company in Strongsville that knowingly dumped barrel after barrel after barrel of arsenic into the Rocky River, and it was only fined something like $300,000. These things continue to happen, and people aren't really punished for doing things like that. How can that change?
And so I think it's the same as any other issue in your community. You have to go to your elected officials and pressure them to enforce the regulations that are there, or to get new regulations passed through the council or the Congress or whatever it is. It's and there have been really, over the last 50 or 60 years, a number of these groups that have continued to bring these issues to the forefront. Before even the river burned, there were ladies groups and that worked over the years that kept the issues in the front of the public. And so those are the kinds of activities we as citizens can do when we approach our public officials.
And I would just echo that. Unfortunately, it has to go to the federal level. because that's where the legislation lies. So to have the fines increased right now, that the Congress isn't really amenable to those types of things, but I also think that if the public keeps their outcry up about such issues, then it can change.
And I've got very positive responses from our senators. Both Senator Brown and Senator Portman have together supported these kinds of activities in northern Ohio here.
Andrew?
Yeah, sure.
Just to add, I don't know if you're aware, but the money, the fines, actually, Metro Parks brokered the deal, so the money actually came into local control versus going national. That's only one of the positives. Certainly, we were very disturbed, but I will tell you, citizen advocacy actually helped find what the problem actually was. Anglers that were actually down in the channel actually figured out that something was awry right away, and that's how we were able to get the early detection and early reporting. We're trying to use it for early education to help educate young children about what goes into the waterway. So I think it's a big picture issue. Certainly at some federal level, but at least the money staying here locally within the park system that was greatly affected by it, and the water corridor.
Right. There were a couple other hands back there as well. Sure. Do you want to come on? Just come on up to the mic up here.
Does the mic work?
Yes.
Oh.
We're capturing the audio too. So.
All right. I have kind of an apocryphal story to start with, and then a couple questions. I still work at John Carroll part-time, but I work at John Carroll when one of the biology professors there, who started work around 1968 after he got his PhD at Ohio State, was teaching biology at John Carroll, and he told me this in confidence. The gentleman just died within the last year, but I won't use his name. But he said that he and a couple of his students took a few 5-gallon cans of kerosene down to the Cuyahoga on that night in 1969 and floated it on the Cuyahoga and lit it, because he knew, because of Mayor Stokes, that there was a lot of national attention focused on Cleveland at that time. And so he always said that he and his students were responsible for the burning river. Apocryphal. But
Incendiary.
yeah. Well, it worked out okay. But anyway, he was a good guy, and he usually told the truth. Two questions. One was, you guys were talking about the dredge of the river being dumped in the lake as an EPA idea. I thought it was an Army Corps of Engineer idea.
Army Corps.
Army Corps, yes. Yeah. I'm sorry.
All right. So the EPA is against that, as I understand it.
Right.
Okay. And the other thing, nobody mentioned in the navigational channel the lack of oxygen. As soon as that water goes from shallow to 25 or whatever it is feet deep, oxygen becomes a real problem for those mini minnows that want to get back.
I can actually address that because I mentioned the project that the ODNR has been doing, and Kevin Kale, who's one of the researchers that's been looking at that, we actually have some data monitors in the river. There are 3 or 4 that are doing continuous monitoring of oxygen and pH levels. Plus, they come and pass through the river at least monthly. And what they've been finding over the last 3 years is that the oxygen levels are high enough for fish in the river. So that's another good news issue. And that was pretty astounding. He just actually reported that to us about a month ago.
And you think that's part of the installation of those screens with plants?
They're not in place yet. The habitats aren't in place yet. So we're not really sure. One of the other things they found was that there is a high temperature plume, and that may be another issue. But most of the time in the river, the oxygen levels are fine for fish, because we did think that at the bottom it was really low to no oxygen, but we're finding that that's not the case.
All right.
So.
Fantastic. Anybody else? You actually, oh, go ahead.
Two of the city services that disappeared totally are street cleaning and leaf pickup, and it happened at the same time that Governor Kasich took back all of the state sales tax money that used to go to local governments. What kind of an impact has that had on storm sewers and the kind of debris and junk that ends up in the storm sewer system versus what, we used to get our streets cleaned once a month at least during the good weather periods, and now every curb is just full of trash and blowing leaves and not that sort of stuff, and it has been for the last 4 or 5 years.
And I wonder if Janita could also comment on this, if any of you have any perspective or...
I'll do my best. Well, the good news is City Council did allocate some money in this year's budget for leaf waste pickup in high leaf generation areas, so that is good. It should help the problem. I mean, locally, our water pollution control department is responsible and sucks a lot of that stuff out of the local storm sewers in the city of Cleveland. And they're an enterprise fund. They have the money to do that. Public Works money to do the street sweeping comes from general fund, which is comes through taxes, which has been declining. I think we have the same amount of general fund in 2015 as we did in 2006. So if you do the math, that doesn't account for inflation. It's a challenge and a struggle. We are doing street sweeping. We're doing limited leaf pickup. To the extent possible that residents can rake and bag leaves, it helps out. We know that we'd like to bring back the leaf pickup program fully at some point.
Come on up.
I'll forget my question by the time.
I know, it's such a long hike.
Talking about legacy sediment and going back to the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, how harmful is that sediment as it's dredged up and utilized for the Cleveland Browns Stadium and for Dike 14? If that sediment gets disturbed, I think there might have been earlier this week maybe a conversation on WCPN. I apologize if I'm wrong about that, and the fact that Lake Erie is very shallow. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes. And therefore additional pollution is a problem. So the legacy sediment issue, in the future, could that be a problem?
To my knowledge, the confined landfills are capped so that it shouldn't be a problem in terms of the sediments coming out on the surface. Sorry? Well, that's why they're confined landfills. So they're sealed off so that groundwater doesn't go in and that the material coming out of them does not get out.
So those are plastic enclosures?
I don't know that.
Oh,
There's some
I
type
think they
of
are.
impermeable material,
Some
and it's
kind of
probably
plastic.
plastic or some kind of
So
material.
it's a big pillow full of trash.
Yeah.
So are you
And
saying that
sometimes a clay
it's not a
lining,
problem?
too. No,
That-
it shouldn't be from the confined landfills. That's why they're called confined landfills. So in terms of dumping in the lake, that can be an issue. And the Central Basin, which is what we have out here, is the shallower of, well, the Western Basin's really shallow, but it mixes because of winds and things like that, whereas the shallow basin is, it actually sets up different layers in the summertime. And if you've heard about the dead zone, that actually is created because of nutrients and decomposition in the bottom, that there's not enough bottom water with enough oxygen in it, and it depletes it over the summer. So shallowing the lake or adding more nutrients to the system could exacerbate that problem in the Central Basin.
So the legacy of the burning river still exists.
Well,
The
when I
shallow
talk
regions.
about legacy sediments, I'm talking more about the industrial pollutants, so toxins, heavy organic things, nasty, persistent pollutants that are, by and large, confined in the landfills. And to some extent, I guess what the Army Corps is arguing is that those toxins aren't as prevalent in the sediments as they used to be. And again, it goes back to a lot of the sediments coming into the navigational today are coming from upstream. And so the pollutants they carry are nutrients, which are a different type of pollution. And to some extent, they could be herbicides and pesticides coming from residential areas or commercial areas.
Thank you. Okay. Are there any other questions? You're raising your hand, so come on up.
I live on Martin Luther King Jr. Drive right near the Baldwin filtration plant, and I take my dog on a walk all the time down Lou Stokes Boulevard, so it's full of history. And I pick up trash along the way, and there's some other ladies in the neighborhood, and they pick up trash. But remember Lady Bird Johnson and, you know, the whole movement to clean up the country. I remember in Mad Men there's an episode where they have a picnic and just, toss the trash, because that's what people used to do. But I think we're back there. I pick up whole bags of trash that people throw out of their cars. And it seems to me that there should be some kind of leadership in creating a clean city. Like Lady Bird Johnson did for the country.
So what would that look like to you?
That would be...
Blame it on him. No, I mean, you're like, he's in charge of it.
I used to teach.
There is.
I used to teach in Cleveland schools. Yeah. Schools are a great place to get kids excited about something they can do. Signs, some kind of mascot or whatever. We have mascot for football teams. We have mascots for everything else. We have a big deal when teams change uniforms. But what about creating some energy? I mean, it's disgusting. We got a brand new street. MLK looks so beautiful. And every day, pick up trash, pick up trash. And it needs to be more than the two ladies on MLK. We're not doing anything there.
Well, Janita...
But city leadership, and when I'm picking up, I think, gosh, why can't the city get behind a beautiful, clean it up, make it beautiful kind of campaign?
Janita is in that position, so...
I mean, I think there are so many initiatives that go on in the city, and whether you're involved with them or not, there are tons of different things that you can do to get involved when it comes to cleaning up our city.
And Amy, would you maybe at this point want to come up and talk about your role? And then we'll do the drawing for the books in the rain barrel, and then we will. You can feel free to hang out, grab drinks, grab food. The stew is delicious, and enjoy this beautiful place. So
they bring me in as
the
closer usually. So my name is Amy, and I work for the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. And to respond to your question, I think there are so many initiatives that go on in the city. Some people don't know about them, but if you really search and scratch the surface, you're going to find there are so many people and so many groups doing so many great works in here. Stephen Love is in the back, who does all the cleanups on Euclid Beach and Edgewater Beach. Yeah, fantastic stuff. But there's some things where it's like if the cleanup isn't going on in an area, you may have to be the person who starts that up, and don't wait for somebody else to do it. If it's not happening...
But there can be a leadership that says, we want to...
That's you. No.
That was right.
But it's true. Like if you see something going on somewhere and it's not happening, like Edgewater Beach, I think people clean up Edgewater Beach. There's almost too many groups cleaning up Edgewater Beach, because the Metro Parks cleans it up now. But there are so many groups that clean it up constantly, where we can take those efforts and focus them elsewhere, not to ditch Edgewater. But so I work for the Soil and Water Conservation District, and a lot of what I heard you guys talk about on this was, I'm going to get a little technical, was point source pollution, or pollution that comes from a definable source. So you have an industry or factory, you have the waste stream, and then it goes out into the waterway. So that was how the Clean Water Act was passed 10 years later. The waters were cleaning up, but not as much as they originally thought that they would, simplifying matters quite a bit. So they started regulating, under the Clean Water Act, non-point source pollution, or what's called stormwater pollution. So who knows what that is? And yes, I'm going to make you interact with me. Janita, what is stormwater pollution? Testing.
Stormwater pollution comes from runoff.
Okay, yeah.
So it's, the fertilizer, phosphorus, nitrogen,
right.
Oil slicks on the road, etc. This is like a test.
It totally is a test. You didn't even know sitting next to me. So stormwater pollution is everything that we do. It's look next to yourself, to your partner, your neighbors, whoever. It's everything we do on our lawns, at our schools, at our churches, at our businesses, whatever. And all of those is more harmful than any industry could ever do. It's that cumulative effect of all of those pollutants going on. There's a really great special on PBS called Poisoned Waters, and it deals with mainly Puget Sound out west and the Chesapeake Bay out east. And it's not in the special itself, but it's in the supplemental material online on PBS. And the scientists figured out that the amount of oil that's flowing into Puget Sound every 2 years from cars, just from leaking cars, not from industry, the amount of stormwater pollution from oil from cars is equivalent to one Exxon Valdez oil spill. So you guys remember that in 1989? What did everyone do? They freaked out, right? So it's happening, and it's happening not at that big catastrophic event. It's happening all these different little events. And that's just one stormwater pollutant. So you have oil and gas from leaking cars, fertilizers and pesticide, like Janita mentioned, dog waste. Who's got a dog? Who picks up after their dog? You better raise your hand. Okay, but still, he said they only go in his yard. Water rushes over that, and it brings bacteria like E. coli into our waterways, into our storm drains, out to our creeks untreated, and out to our drinking water, out to Lake Erie. So next time I see you, I'm going to go up to your neighborhood. You have sediment, which is soil runoff, which is the biggest pollutant in our waterways. A lot of people don't know that. So litter, garbage. So if you're looking for a takeaway from this, the industries are regulated, as Julie said, that they have permits now. There's fines that go against them. If you're looking for a takeaway from this, there's things that you can do at home to help out with this. We do stormwater pollution as death by 1,000 cuts. So if you get one cut on your arm, you're cool. You're going to be fine. You get 1,000 cuts on your body, you're going to suffer from disease, infection, you may risk death. The same exact thing is happening to the environment. So one, dog waste left in the yard when over-fertilization is not enough to take down our waterways, but the cumulative effect of everything we can do is more powerful than anything any industry or factory could ever do. So we can put the proverbial Band-Aid on those 1,000 cuts by doing rain gardens with native plants that have nice long root systems. We can stop fertilizing, or if you choose to fertilize, get your soil tested. You can install rain barrels, which you're giving away tonight, pick up your dog waste, tons of, get your car maintenance, such simple things that you can do to help out to reverse those stormwater pollutants. And again, we are that problem, and we can also be that solution.
If we could give another round of applause to our panelists and to the people that came to speak. Again, feel free to stick around, hang out, get drinks, support Merwin's Wharf, and we'll see you next month at the next Living History. Thank you.